In the spring of 1992, a demolition crew in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, took a wrecking ball to a small clapboard church that had stood on a hillside for 140 years. The congregation had dwindled to 11 people. The roof had caved in during an ice storm the winter before. The county condemned the structure and ordered it torn down. It should have taken a single afternoon. It took 9 days. Because when the foreman drove a spike into the ground behind the pulpit to mark the foundation line, the spike kept going. 2 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet. It did not stop until the entire 18-inch spike had vanished into the earth without hitting anything. The foreman knelt down, put his ear to the hole, and heard air moving. Not wind, not water, air, moving through a space that was not supposed to exist. What they found beneath that church over the next 9 days would be photographed twice, documented once in a county report that was filed, and then quietly removed from the archive 3 months later, and then sealed off with reinforced concrete on the direct order of a federal agency that has never explained why it was there. There was a tunnel underneath the church. The tunnel was older than the church by a margin nobody in Pocahontas County was prepared to accept. And every wall, from the entrance shaft down to the chambers at the bottom, was covered in drawings that did not belong to any culture that was supposed to have ever lived in those mountains. Symbols carved into the stone. Figures painted in a red ochre that carbon dated to a period that does not match the accepted history of the American continent. And in the deepest chamber, past a doorway that had been sealed from the inside, they found something that ended the excavation, ended the careers of 2 of the men who saw it, and sent the third to a psychiatric facility in Weston for the rest of his life. What was under that church was not built by the people who built the church. It was built by whoever came before them, and what was in it had been waiting. Before we go any further into what came out of that tunnel, and out of the 17 other churches across the Appalachian range that showed the exact same pattern once people started looking, I want you to do one thing. In the comments, type the name of the county and state you are watching from right now. Just the county and the state. Because we are building a map of every location where a church, a courthouse, a schoolhouse, or a barn was built directly on top of something older that nobody talked about. If your county has a story like this, tell it. And if it does not, watch to the end, because you might realize it does and nobody ever put the pieces together. The comments are the map. Start filling it in. The church was called Mount Zera Missionary Baptist. It sat on a rise of pasture land 11 miles east of the town of Marlinton, on a dirt road that had no name until the county assigned it a number in 1963. According to the deed on file at the Pocahontas County Courthouse, the land had been granted to a man named Ephraim Trout in 1847, and the church was raised on it in 1852 by a circuit rider named Reverend Silas Dorman, who preached to a congregation of 23 farming families across 3 surrounding hollows. That is the official history. That is what the historical marker on the highway said until the historical marker was quietly removed in 1994. The building itself was unremarkable. White painted clapboard, a single steeple with a cast iron bell brought up from Charleston by mule cart in 1855, 12 pews, oak, hand-joined. A pulpit carved from a single piece of black walnut that the elder Trout was said to have felled on the property himself. Behind the pulpit, a small door led to a storage room where the choir robes were kept. Under the storage room was the crawl space. Under the crawl space, according to every set of building records and every county survey conducted between 1852 and 1992, was nothing but bedrock. That was the answer for 140 years, nothing but bedrock. The congregation of Mount Zera peaked at just under 200 people in the 1920s, when coal money briefly flooded the surrounding hollows and every farming family sent at least 2 sons down into the mines. After the mines closed in the late 1950s, the congregation began its long, slow decline. By 1990, only 17 active members remained. By 1992, that number was 11, and 8 of those 11 were over the age of 70. When the ice storm of January 1992 collapsed the eastern half of the roof and cracked the main support beam that ran the length of the sanctuary, the remaining congregation voted to accept a state inspection. The inspection concluded that the building was structurally compromised beyond repair. The county condemned the structure on March 11th. The demolition contract was awarded to a small local firm called Boone Excavation and Salvage, owned and operated by a man named Roy Boone, who had been demolishing barns and outbuildings in Pocahontas County for over 30 years. Boone had never encountered anything in his professional life that could not be handled with the equipment he owned and the four-man crew he employed. The Mount Zera job was scheduled for a single afternoon in early April. Roy Boone would later tell the state police, in the sworn deposition he gave in October of that year, that if he had known what was underneath the church, he would have set fire to the entire property, cashed the check, and told the county it was rubble. He said this on the record. The deposition still exists. It is 51 pages long. Boone and his crew arrived at Mount Zera on the morning of April 6th. The plan was straightforward. They would pull the pews and the pulpit for salvage. They would strip the copper wiring and the pipe from the walls. They would take the bell down for the County Historical Society. Then they would bring in the small yellow excavator that Boone kept on a flatbed trailer, and they would knock the walls in one at a time, starting from the back. The foundation would be broken up on the second day. The debris would be hauled off on the third. It was, in Boone's own words, a job for a Tuesday. They started at 7 in the morning. By 10, the pews were out and stacked in the churchyard. By noon, the bell was down. By 2 o'clock, Boone had the excavator running and had punched the first hole through the eastern wall. That was when the youngest man on the crew, a 19-year-old named Ellis Craft, walked around to the back of the building to relieve himself in the tree line and noticed that the ground behind the church was warmer than the ground in front of it. He put his hand flat on the grass. Then he put his cheek on it. Then he ran back to Roy Boone and told him that the earth was breathing. Boone laughed at him. He told Ellis to get back to work. But when the boy would not stop insisting, Boone walked around to the back of the church himself, and he put his own hand on the grass, and he felt it, warm earth in April. In West Virginia, where the frost had only just come out of the topsoil 3 weeks before, Boone marked the spot with a wooden stake. He drove the stake in with a hand sledge. The stake was 18 inches long. It went in like the ground was made of straw. When Boone pulled it back out, the tip of the stake was wet, and the wetness smelled like something Boone could not identify. He described it in the deposition as smelling like a root cellar that had been sealed up for 100 years, mixed with something metallic. Something like copper wire when it is heated. Boone stopped the demolition. He sent Ellis Craft down to the county road with instructions to drive to the payphone at the gas station in Marlinton and call the county surveyor. The surveyor's name was Delbert Hensley. Hensley arrived at Mount Zera at 4:45 that afternoon, took one look at the hole where the stake had gone in, and told Roy Boone to get everyone off the property immediately. Delbert Hensley had grown up in Pocahontas County. He had been the county surveyor for 26 years. He told Boone that he had heard stories from his grandfather about places like this, places where the ground did not sound right. He said his grandfather had a word for them. He would not say the word out loud in front of Ellis Craft. He told Boone he would come back in the morning with proper equipment. He told the crew to leave the excavator where it was and to walk down to their trucks and drive home. He told them not to come back until he called them. Before we move on to the first descent stop for a second, what you just heard about the warm ground behind the church is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Hensley field notes. The stake depth, the soil temperature. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Delbert Hensley returned to Mount Zera at 6 the next morning with 3 men. One of them was his brother-in-law, a mining engineer named Corbin Wells, who had worked coal for the Elk River Company for 31 years and had come up through the deep seams around Beckley. The second was a geologist from West Virginia University named Dr. Marion Priddy, who had done her doctorate on the karst formations of the eastern Allegheny Plateau. The third was the Pocahontas County Sheriff, a man named Buford Prather. Hensley had called all 3 of them personally the night before. He had not slept. He had spent most of the night in his kitchen with a bottle of bourbon and a topographical map of the Mount Zera property spread out on his table, and by dawn he had circled 7 other locations within a 15-mile radius where he suspected the same phenomenon existed. He would not explain the circles to the other men when they arrived. He said only that they needed to open the ground behind the church before he would explain anything. They opened it with hand shovels. Roy Boone's excavator sat unused 20 feet away. Hensley said the vibration from the machine might collapse whatever was underneath, so they dug by hand in a 2-foot square downward for 4 hours. At the 4-hour mark, Corbin Wells's shovel struck stone, not bedrock, cut stone. Corbin knelt in the pit and brushed away the loose soil, and he saw a slab of dressed limestone with a chiselled edge, set into the earth with the deliberate flatness of a paving tile. He called Marion Priddy down into the hole with him. She looked at the slab for a long time. She did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then she stood up and told Delbert Hensley, in a voice that Corbin Wells later described as sounding very small and very far away, that the stone was not native to the region. The limestone in that part of Pocahontas County had a specific granular composition that any geologist working in the area could identify by sight. This stone was not that limestone. It was denser. It was older. It had come from somewhere else. And it had been cut with tools that left no visible marks. Marion Priddy told Hensley that she wanted to see the underside of the slab before she said anything else. It took them another 3 hours to lift it. Corbin Wells rigged a block and tackle from a chestnut tree at the edge of the pasture, and they hoisted the slab out of the pit by hand. It weighed, according to the estimate Corbin gave to the state police, somewhere between 600 and 700 pounds. The underside of the slab was polished smooth. In the centre of the polished surface was a symbol. Marion Priddy photographed the symbol before anyone touched it. She took 27 photographs of it from different angles, with a 35mm camera she kept in her fieldwork bag. The symbol was a spiral, wound tight, with 7 arms radiating outward from the centre at unequal intervals. Around the outside of the spiral was a ring of small carved marks that looked like letters, but were not letters from any alphabet Marion Priddy recognized. She told the other men she wanted to send the photographs to a colleague at the Smithsonian. She said the colleague specialized in pre-Columbian rock art from the eastern woodland cultures. She said she had never seen anything like this in the region. Under the slab was a shaft. The shaft was cylindrical, about 5 feet in diameter, and it went straight down into the earth for as far as the flashlight beam would reach. The walls of the shaft were cut stone, not blasted, not dug, cut. The tool marks on the inside of the shaft, where any tool marks should have been visible, were absent entirely. The stone had been worked smooth from top to bottom, and there was no seam where one stone met the next. It was as if the entire shaft had been carved out of a single continuous piece of the mountain. Corbin Wells, who had spent 31 years underground, told Delbert Hensley that he had never seen anything like this in a mine, in a cave, or in any excavation site he had ever worked on. He said the shaft was impossible. Not difficult, impossible. He said there was no method known to him by which a 5-foot cylindrical shaft could be cut through solid limestone bedrock without leaving tool marks and without a visible seam. Delbert Hensley asked how deep the shaft was. Corbin dropped a small stone into it and counted. He counted for 6 full seconds before he heard the stone hit the bottom. Marion Priddy did the math in her head and told them the shaft was between 180 and 200 feet deep. There were carved handholds set into the wall of the shaft at regular intervals. Each handhold was cut in the shape of a small crescent. The crescents were spaced exactly 17 inches apart from top to bottom. Marion Priddy climbed down first. She wore a headlamp borrowed from Corbin's toolbox and carried her camera in a canvas satchel slung across her chest. She descended slowly, using the crescent handholds, and she called up her observations to the men above her every 10 feet. At 30 feet down, the walls were smooth. At 60 feet down, the walls began to show markings. At 90 feet down, she stopped calling up. Corbin Wells shouted her name 3 times before she answered. When she did answer, her voice was different. Corbin later said she sounded like she had been crying, but he was not sure. She told him to come down. She told him to bring the sheriff. She told him not to bring the shovels. She said, and Corbin remembered this word for word, she said the walls were not walls. She said the walls were a record. And whoever kept the record had been keeping it for longer than any human being should have been standing on that continent. Corbin Wells and Sheriff Buford Prather descended together, one after the other, using the crescent handholds. Delbert Hensley stayed at the top of the shaft with a two-way radio and a length of nylon rope tied around his waist. It took them almost 20 minutes to reach the bottom. When they arrived, they found Marion Priddy standing in the centre of a chamber that neither of them was ready to describe to the state police in the depositions they would give later that year. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 40 feet across, with a domed ceiling that rose to a height of maybe 20 feet at the centre. The walls of the chamber were carved from the same seamless stone as the shaft. There were no visible joints anywhere. The floor was smooth and slightly concave, sloping toward a shallow depression in the centre that had been carved into the shape of a bowl, and the walls, from floor to ceiling, were covered in drawings. Not carved, not chiselled, painted. In a red ochre that Marion Priddy would later have analysed by a lab at the University of Kentucky, and which would return a carbon date range that no journal would publish. The drawings covered every square inch of the wall surface. They began at ankle height and rose all the way to the top of the dome. In some places the images overlapped, as if the artist, or the artists, had run out of clean wall and had begun painting new figures over older ones. There was a hierarchy to the images. At the bottom, near the floor, were smaller figures, densely packed, arranged in rows like a written text. As the eye moved upward, the figures grew larger, and the density decreased. At the very top of the dome, occupying the entire ceiling in a single unbroken composition, was one enormous figure that Marion Priddy could not initially bring herself to look at directly. Sheriff Buford Prather described the figure on the ceiling in his official report as being humanoid in outline but not human. He said it had the general shape of a person, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, the head was too small in relation to the body, and from the shoulders, extending outward and upward, were two curving structures that Buford could not decide whether to call wings, horns, or antennae. He said the figure was painted in the same red ochre as everything else, but the ochre used for the ceiling figure had been mixed with something dark, something that gave the paint a sheen when the flashlight beam struck it at the correct angle. He said the figure was surrounded by smaller shapes that seemed to be either descending from it or ascending toward it. He could not tell which. Marion Priddy focused her attention on the walls. She spent the next 4 hours photographing every panel she could reach. She used up 3 rolls of 36 exposure film and asked Corbin to climb back up the shaft to bring more. While she photographed, she catalogued. She spoke her observations into a small handheld cassette recorder that she also kept in her fieldwork bag. The cassette from that afternoon still exists. A single copy was made in 1993 and was placed in a private archive that has since been transferred to the special collections of a university that has requested not to be named. The catalogue, transcribed from the cassette, ran to 58 typed pages. Marion Priddy identified 11 distinct categories of imagery on the chamber walls. The first category was what she called the row figures. These were small, stylized human shapes, painted in profile, arranged in horizontal bands around the lower portion of the walls. Each figure was distinct. No two were identical. Some carried objects. Some appeared to be leading animals. Some were bound at the wrists and being led by others. Marion counted over 400 of these figures in the lower band alone. The second category was what she called the star maps. These were groupings of dots, painted in white pigment mixed with the red ochre, arranged in patterns that Marion recognized. She recognized them because she had, as an undergraduate, taken an elective in observational astronomy. The dot patterns on the walls of the chamber corresponded to constellations visible in the northern hemisphere sky. But the constellations were not arranged as they would appear now. The angles were slightly wrong. Marion, using a small notebook, calculated the precession of the equinoxes required to shift the constellations from their current positions to the positions painted on the walls. Her rough estimate, done in the chamber by flashlight, was somewhere between 9,000 and 12,000 years. She stopped calculating after that. The third category was what she called the animal registry. These were paintings of animals, executed with an anatomical accuracy that Marion, who had studied comparative zoology for 2 semesters in graduate school, found deeply unsettling. Some of the animals were identifiable. There were deer, there were bears. There were what appeared to be mountain lions and wolves. But there were other animals in the registry that Marion could not identify. There was a large four-legged creature with a heavy shoulder hump and a long snout that resembled no animal currently living in North America. There was something that looked like a giant sloth, painted at roughly the correct proportional scale to the human figures in the row bands, meaning that the sloth in the painting would have stood at full height over 12 feet tall. There was a bird with a wingspan that Marion estimated, based on comparison to the human figures, at approximately 20 feet. The fourth category was what she called the machinery. These were geometric shapes, painted with a precision that suggested the use of straight edges and compasses, arranged in configurations that Marion could not interpret. Some of the shapes resembled wheels, some resembled gears, some resembled things Marion had no vocabulary for. She photographed them all. The fifth category was what she called the architecture. These were paintings of buildings, structures, and cityscapes, executed in a style that appeared to be attempting to convey three-dimensional perspective on a two-dimensional surface. The buildings in the paintings did not resemble any architecture Marion associated with the pre-Columbian Eastern woodland cultures. They had columns, they had domes, they had stepped pyramids, they had towers that rose to impossible heights, and in every architectural painting, in the sky above the buildings, were the small ascending or descending shapes that also surrounded the great figure on the ceiling. The sixth category was what she called the vessels. These were paintings of ceramic and metallic containers of various shapes, arranged as if in a museum inventory, each one accompanied by a small mark that Marion suspected functioned as a caption or a label. Some of the vessels in the paintings resembled the small lidded jars that Marion had not yet seen but was about to encounter in the passage of niches beyond the door. Others resembled objects she had no reference for. There was one vessel painted in profile that appeared to be roughly the size and shape of a person, upright, hollow, with an opening at the top and small carved apertures along the sides. Marion did not know what to make of it. She photographed it 3 times. The seventh category was what she called the calendar. This was a single continuous band, about 8 inches high, that ran around the entire circumference of the chamber at approximately shoulder height. The band was divided into small cells by vertical strokes, and each cell contained a small symbol. Marion counted the cells. There were 365 of them. Inside each cell, a specific symbol had been painted. The symbols were not repeated in any pattern Marion could identify. She recognized among them several symbols that appeared on ancient calendar systems from other regions, including the Egyptian decan system and the Mesoamerican day signs. But the majority of the symbols on the Mount Zera calendar band were not from any calendar tradition Marion knew. She stopped in front of one of them, a small figure of a person kneeling beside what appeared to be a doorway, and she looked at it for a long time. She would later say, in her cassette recording, that she believed that particular symbol marked a specific day in the year on which the doorway was expected to open. She did not know which doorway. The 8th category was what she called the water forms. These were paintings of what Marion took to be bodies of water, executed in a blue pigment that she found nowhere else in the chamber. The water forms did not correspond to any known geographic features of the eastern Allegheny Plateau. They depicted an inland sea, or perhaps a very large lake, surrounded by mountains, with what appeared to be settlements along its shores. Marion, who had studied the paleogeography of the region as part of her doctoral work, noted that the plateau had, in the Devonian period, been covered by an inland sea, but that period ended approximately 360 million years before the arrival of any hominid on the North American continent. The paintings of the inland sea on the walls of the chamber, therefore, could not depict anything that any human being should have been in a position to remember. And yet the settlements on the shores of the painted sea were rendered in the same architectural style as the buildings in the 5th category, with columns and domes and stepped pyramids. The 9th category was what she called the flight sequence. This was a series of paintings that ran along the eastern arc of the chamber wall, showing, in progressive frames, one of the small ascending shapes leaving the ground, rising past the buildings, entering the sky, and eventually disappearing among a field of stars. The sequence appeared to depict either a departure or an arrival. Marion could not tell which. The 10th category was what she called the burials. These were paintings of prone human figures, laid out on rectangular platforms, surrounded by mourners. In each burial scene, The body on the platform was painted in a slightly different colour than the mourners, suggesting perhaps that the deceased was not of the same population as the living. The mourners in the burial scenes wore garments that resembled long robes with high collars. The bodies on the platforms wore nothing at all, and their limbs, in every image, were disproportionately long. The 11th category, and the last one Marion catalogued before turning her attention to what she had begun to suspect was hidden on the fourth wall, was what she called the Visitations. These were paintings arranged in a vertical column on the western wall, showing the great winged figure from the ceiling descending, one image at a time, from a position high in the sky down to a position at ground level, where it appeared to interact with human figures who were kneeling before it. In the final image of the visitation sequence, the winged figure and the kneeling humans were shown together, entering an opening in the ground. The opening in the painting, Marion noted, was rectangular. It had the same proportions as the doorway she would find, less than an hour later, on the fourth wall. She called it, in her own words, the door. Before we go through the door that Marion Priddy found on the far wall of the chamber, and before we go down through the passages that opened up beyond it, you need to understand something about the church that was built on top of all this. Because the church was not the beginning of the story. The church was the last chapter of a story that had been going on for a very long time, and the people who built the church knew it. Delbert Hensley, after the events of that week, spent the next 8 months of his life in the county archives at Marlinton. He requested and reviewed every document connected to the Mount Zera property that had been filed between the year 1820 and the year 1890. He found 17 documents that had been previously uncatalogued, filed under an obsolete indexing system that had been abandoned by the county recorder in the 1890s and never fully transferred to the new system. What Delbert found in those 17 documents rewrote the history of the church, and by extension the history of that section of Pocahontas County, in a way that Delbert never spoke about publicly for the rest of his life. The land grant to Ephraim Trout in 1847 was not the first grant of that parcel, it was the fourth. The first recorded grant of the property had been issued by the colonial government of Virginia in the year 1742 to a man named Thaddeus Whipple, who had received the land as compensation for services rendered during the survey expeditions of Colonel Peter Jefferson. Whipple had never lived on the property. He had transferred the deed within 8 months of receiving it to a company registered in Philadelphia called the Allegheny Discoveries Company. The Allegheny Discoveries Company held the deed for 23 years. During that period, according to a single ledger page that Delbert Hensley found tucked inside a bound volume of unrelated county records, the company had conducted excavations on the property. The ledger page listed expenditures for tools, for wages paid to a crew of 11 men, and for shipments of materials to and from the property between the years 1743 and 1752. The word tunnels appeared 4 times on the ledger page. The word chamber appeared twice. The word sealed appeared once. In 1765, the Allegheny Discoveries Company dissolved. The deed to the Mount Zera property was transferred to a private individual named Colonel Isaiah Culpeper, who held it until his death in 1781. Culpeper willed the land to his nephew, a man named Josiah Culpeper, who transferred it in 1806 to a religious congregation calling itself the Assembly of the Second Watch. The Assembly of the Second Watch held the property for 41 years. This is the part that Delbert Hensley found most difficult to reconcile, because during those 41 years there was no building on the property. The Assembly did not construct a meeting house, a residence, or any other visible structure on the parcel. The land appears, on every county tax roll from 1806 through 1847, as undeveloped grazing land. And yet the Assembly, according to the correspondence files of the Pocahontas County Clerk during that period, paid a substantial annual tax on the property, filed regular reports of their stewardship, and hosted, according to at least 3 separate documents Delbert located, quarterly gatherings on the site that were attended by members travelling from as far away as Boston and Charleston. What the Assembly of the Second Watch was doing on the property during the 4 decades it held title is nowhere recorded in any document Delbert was able to locate. But when the Assembly finally divested itself of the land in 1847, the transfer of the deed to Ephraim Trout was accompanied by a document that Delbert found folded into the back of the deed book in an envelope sealed with red wax and labelled only with the words "for the caretaker only." The document was 1 page long. It was signed by the last presiding elder of the assembly, a man whose name was recorded as Elder Nathaniel Croft. The document instructed Ephraim Trout, and by extension all future owners of the property, to build upon the land within 5 years of receipt of the deed. It specified that the building should be a house of Christian worship. It specified that the building should be placed directly over a point marked with a wooden stake driven into the earth behind what would become the pulpit. And it specified that under no circumstances was the ground beneath the building ever to be broken, disturbed, or excavated. The document ended with a single line, written in a different hand than the body of the letter. The line read, "They sleep only if we sing above them." Delbert Hensley found this document on the 14th of June, 1992. He did not sleep that night either. He drove out to Mount Zera at 3 in the morning, parked his truck at the end of the dirt road, walked up to what remained of the church foundation, and stood there in the dark until the sun came up. He would later tell his brother-in-law Corbin that he had spent that night trying to remember every hymn he had ever heard sung in a country church, and trying to decide whether any of them had been sung loud enough to matter. The church, in other words, was not built to be a church. The church was built to be a lid, and for 140 years the people of Mount Zera Missionary Baptist had gathered every Sunday morning in the sanctuary above the shaft, and they had sung hymns, and they had preached sermons, and they had prayed, and they had done all of this directly above something that had been placed under a wax-sealed instruction never to be uncovered. Roy Boone's wrecking ball had broken the seal, and Delbert Hensley, standing in the pasture at dawn on the 15th of June, understood that whatever was down there, in the chamber under the shaft, was now uncovered, and that the singing had stopped. The question of who built the chamber is a question that Marion Priddy asked out loud in the recorded interview she gave to a small documentary crew in the fall of 1993, 6 months before she left the field of geology permanently and took a position as a librarian in a small town in eastern Oregon, where she lived quietly for the remaining 22 years of her life. In that interview, she said the following. She said that the accepted history of pre-Columbian eastern North America accounts for a specific set of cultures, in a specific set of locations, using a specific set of technologies, and that everything in the chamber under Mount Zera violated every element of that accepted history. The stone-cutting technology required to produce the shaft and the dome chamber did not exist, according to the archaeological record, anywhere on the North American continent at any point before contact with European civilization. The pigment analysis on the wall paintings suggested a manufacturing process involving mineral compounds that were not, in the same accepted archaeological record, in use in eastern North America at any known period. The stellar cartography painted on the chamber walls corresponded, by her calculation, to a sky that had not existed above that latitude for at least 9,000 years. And the anatomical accuracy of the animal registry included creatures, specifically the giant sloth and the 20-foot wingspan bird that had gone extinct on the North American continent at the end of the Pleistocene, meaning at a period at least 10,000 years before any culture that could conceivably have produced the chamber was supposed to have existed. She said, at the end of that interview, that she believed the chamber had been constructed by a civilization that the accepted history did not acknowledge. She said she believed this civilization had occupied the Appalachian Range and possibly other portions of the North American continent at a period long predating the arrival of the peoples we now call Native American. She said she believed this civilization had been organized, had possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy and metallurgy and construction, and had left behind a network of subterranean sites that had been systematically covered over, buried, and forgotten by every subsequent wave of human habitation on the continent. She said she did not know what the civilization had called itself. She said she was not sure the civilization had left a name that any surviving language could pronounce. This is where the connection to the older question becomes unavoidable, because the pattern Marion Priddy described of a lost civilization with advanced construction techniques, subterranean architecture, astronomical knowledge, and iconography featuring winged or antennaed humanoid figures, is a pattern that has been reported at other sites across the North American continent, across the Eurasian landmass, and across regions of South America that had never been in contact with the eastern woodlands. Researchers working in this area, working largely outside the mainstream academic institutions and often against significant institutional resistance, have used various names for the civilization that appears to have left these traces. Some have called it the pre-flood civilization, some have called it the antediluvian, some have called it the mud-flood culture, referring to the layer of alluvial sediment that appears to have buried the lower stories of buildings across large portions of the earth in the 17th and 18th centuries. And some have called it, drawing on maps and accounts from a period that European historians have systematically excised from the standard curriculum, by the name that appears on the great cartographic works of the medieval and early modern periods as the Empire of Tartaria. The Empire of Tartaria appears on hundreds of maps published in Europe between the 1400s and the 1800s. It appears on maps produced by the most respected cartographers of those centuries. It appears in encyclopedias published in the 17 and 1800s, and then, over the course of the 19th century, it disappears from the maps and from the encyclopedias until by the year 1900 the name has been almost entirely erased from the historical record. The regions the maps had labelled as Tartaria were reassigned to other names. The people who had been called Tartars in the earlier records were reclassified as belonging to other ethnic and national groups. The buildings, the roads, the fortifications, and the cities that the older accounts had attributed to Tartarian construction were reattributed to other civilizations, or were declared to have been built by no one in particular, or were simply not mentioned. What happened to Tartaria, according to the researchers who have taken up this question, is that it was written out of history, and the reason it was written out of history was that its existence was incompatible with the version of history that the emerging nation-states of the 19th century needed in order to legitimize their own claims to sovereignty, to territory, and to civilizational primacy. The chamber under Mount Zera, according to the pattern that Marion Priddy documented in her cassette and her photographs, appears to belong to the same civilizational tradition. The seven-armed spiral on the underside of the entrance slab is a symbol that has been documented on stone artifacts recovered from sites in the Ural Mountains of Central Asia, from the coastal plains of the Yucatan, and from the interior highlands of Peru. The 17-inch spacing of the crescent handholds inside the shaft is a spacing that corresponds precisely to a unit of measurement identified in a set of surveyor's notes recovered from a demolished building in the city of Kazan, Russia, dating from the 1600s, notes that describe the standard measurement used by the last generation of Tartarian builders before the empire vanished from the records. The domed chamber with the concave floor and the central bowl-shaped depression matches, in every dimensional detail, a description recorded by a French Jesuit missionary named Père Bertrand Duvalier, who claimed to have entered a similar chamber in the interior of what is now Kazakhstan in the year 1672, and who was recalled to Rome shortly thereafter, and whose written accounts were placed in the sealed section of the Vatican archives and have not been reviewed by any independent researcher in over 300 years. The evidence does not stop with these 3 points of correspondence. The red ochre pigment that Marion Priddy sent to the University of Kentucky lab in the summer of 1992 was subjected to a spectrographic analysis that identified as one of its principal binding agents a compound derived from the crushed shells of a specific mollusk species. That mollusk species is not native to the freshwater systems of the Appalachian range, or indeed to any freshwater system on the North American continent. It is native to a series of estuaries on the southeastern coast of the Caspian Sea. The compound, produced from its crushed shells, was, according to a monograph published in Moscow in 1891 and never translated into English, the standard binding agent used in the ceremonial pigments of the eastern Tartarian provinces during the period the monograph identified as the late imperial phase. The pigment on the walls of the chamber, under Mount Zera, in other words, was not only prepared using materials that should not have been available in eastern North America. It was prepared using the specific formula that a distant civilization had used on the other side of the world for a specific purpose. And that specific purpose, according to the same monograph, was the preservation of records that were intended to remain legible for periods of time measured in millennia rather than in centuries. The stellar cartography painted on the walls of the chamber corresponded, by Marion Priddy's calculation, to a sky at least 9,000 years old. The pigment that had preserved that cartography had been formulated by a civilization whose builders knew how to make paint that would last that long. This is not a coincidence. This is a matching pair of engineering decisions made by the same people. There is also the question of the crescent handholds inside the shaft. Marion Priddy, in her cassette recording, remarked that the 17-inch spacing seemed too far apart for a comfortable descent by an adult human of average height. She noted that her own limbs, at the standard proportions of a woman of 5 feet 6 inches, had to stretch to reach each successive handhold. The handholds appeared, in her assessment, to have been designed for a body somewhat larger than the average modern human body. She estimated, based on her own reach, that the intended user of the shaft would have stood approximately 7 feet tall, with proportionally longer arms. She wrote this observation in her field notebook, in the same hand that appears throughout her doctoral thesis, and she underlined it twice. The winged figure on the ceiling of the chamber, painted in the same red ochre with the darker admixture that gave it a metallic sheen, matches, in every detail Marion recorded, a class of figures that appear on ceremonial artifacts recovered from sites across Eurasia, dating from before the great erasures of the 19th century. The class of figures is documented, though not systematically studied, in a catalogue compiled by a Danish antiquarian named Jørgen Ekstrand in 1883. The catalogue was reprinted 3 times before 1900. It has not been reprinted since. Copies of the catalogue are held in 7 libraries worldwide, all of them in special collections that require a written application for access. The figures in the Ekstrand catalogue are consistently described in the accompanying text by the same word, translated from the original Danish as the Watchers, or in some passages as the ones who kept the record. The word appears in the ceremonial documents of at least 6 ancient traditions across Eurasia and the Middle East, and it appears, once, in a marginal notation in a manuscript held at a monastery in northern Ethiopia, where the same figure is drawn beside a passage from a text that most Western scholars have chosen to treat as apocryphal. The passage refers to a class of beings who came down to the earth in an earlier age, who taught the arts of metallurgy and stonework to the people they found here, and who were subsequently confined beneath the ground by a covenant that was to be maintained by the singing of the descendants of those they had taught. The chamber under Mount Zera, in other words, was not built by anyone the accepted history says was ever supposed to have lived on the North American continent. It was built by a civilization that the accepted history says never existed, for a purpose that at least 6 ancient traditions describe in nearly identical terms, and using a technology whose components can be sourced to the specific regions of the earth where the Tartarian Empire is documented to have flourished in the centuries before its erasure. And that civilization, whoever they were, left one more thing behind in the chamber that Marion Priddy and Corbin Wells and Sheriff Buford Prather were about to discover, because Marion Priddy had not yet opened the door. The door on the far wall of the chamber was not, at first, visible as a door. It appeared to be simply another section of the painted wall. It was covered, like every other portion of the chamber, in the layered imagery of the red ochre paintings. What made Marion Priddy suspect that it was a door was the pattern of the paintings on that particular section. Around the outside of a roughly rectangular area, the row figures in the lower band did not run continuously as they did on every other wall. They stopped short of the rectangle, and they resumed on the other side of it. The star maps in the middle band avoided the rectangle entirely. The architectural paintings in the upper band flowed around it. It was as if every artist who had ever painted on that wall had known the rectangle was there and had left it clear. The rectangle was approximately 7 feet tall and 3.5 feet wide. Marion, using her fingertips, traced the edges of it. She found, at the 4 corners of the rectangle, small cup-shaped depressions cut into the stone. Each depression was about the size of a walnut. Marion pressed her thumb into one of the depressions. She felt something inside the stone shift. It was not a mechanical click. It was more of a settling, as if a weight somewhere inside the wall had adjusted itself by a fraction of an inch. She looked back at Corbin Wells and at Sheriff Buford Prather. Corbin had gone pale. Buford had drawn his service revolver without seeming to know he had done it. Marion Priddy pressed each of the 4 depressions in turn. On the fourth one, the rectangle in the wall receded inward by about 6 inches, silently, and then slid sideways into a recess cut into the adjacent stone. Beyond the doorway was a passage. The passage extended into the mountain at a slight downward angle. Its walls, like the walls of the chamber, were carved from seamless stone. Its ceiling was low, requiring Corbin, who was the tallest of the three, to duck slightly as he entered. The floor of the passage was smooth. Along the walls of the passage, at eye level, were niches cut into the stone at intervals of approximately 6 feet. Inside each niche was an object. Marion Priddy examined the first niche. Inside it was a small vessel, shaped somewhat like a lidded jar, made of a substance that Marion could not immediately identify. It was neither ceramic nor metal in any way she recognized. It was heavier than it looked. It was cool to the touch. It made no sound when she tapped it with her fingernail. Marion did not open the vessel. She left it in the niche and continued along the passage. There were 47 niches in total, arranged along both walls of the passage. Every niche contained a vessel similar to the first, though they varied in size, in shape, and in the markings incised into their surfaces. Marion photographed each niche as she passed it. She would later count, from the negatives, the exact number of vessels, and would confirm the count of 47. At the end of the passage was a second chamber. This chamber was smaller than the first, roughly 20 feet across, and it was also domed, though the dome was lower. There were no paintings on the walls of the second chamber. The walls were entirely bare. But in the center of the floor was a raised platform cut from the same stone as the walls, and on the platform was a rectangular slab that resembled, in its shape and its proportions, a coffin. The slab was carved from a black stone that Marion did not recognize. It had a highly polished surface. Its lid was inscribed with a single symbol, which Marion photographed from multiple angles. The symbol was the 7-armed spiral, identical to the one on the underside of the entrance slab at the top of the shaft. But the spiral on the coffin was inverted. The center was at the outside, and the arms wound inward. Corbin Wells asked Marion whether she intended to open the coffin. Marion said that she did not. She said that whatever was inside the coffin was, in her professional opinion, none of their business. She said she intended to photograph the exterior, to record the dimensions, and to leave. Buford Prather agreed. Corbin agreed. The three of them turned to leave the second chamber, and that was when Corbin Wells noticed the other doorway. The other doorway was set into the wall, directly behind the coffin. It was not concealed. It was not disguised with paintings. It was a simple rectangular opening, about the same size as the door they had used to enter the passage, but standing open, beyond it, another passage extended into the mountain, and from the passage, faintly, at the edge of Corbin's hearing, came a sound. Corbin described the sound, in the deposition he gave in October of 1992, as being similar to the sound of running water at a great distance, but with a rhythm to it, as if the water were being interrupted by something at regular intervals. He said the sound had a quality he could not describe in words. He said it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He said Sheriff Prather heard it too, and turned white. And he said that Marion Priddy, upon hearing it, did something that Corbin found impossible to reconcile with the composed and professional scientist he had known before that afternoon. Marion Priddy sat down on the floor of the second chamber, put her face in her hands, and began to weep. She wept for perhaps a full minute. Then she got up, wiped her face on the sleeve of her field jacket, picked up her camera, and walked through the second doorway into the third passage. Corbin and Buford followed her. The third passage sloped downward more steeply than the first. It descended, by Corbin's estimate, for another 200 feet before opening into what neither Corbin nor Buford was ever able to fully describe. It was not a chamber, it was not a hall, it was a space so large that the beams of their 3 flashlights did not reach the far wall, did not reach the ceiling, and did not reach the bottom. They were standing on a stone platform, cantilevered out over a vast open volume of dark air, and from somewhere far below them the rhythmic water sound continued. They did not go down. They stood on the platform for a long time, sweeping their flashlight beams out into the darkness, trying to find the edges of the space they had walked into. What they found, in the beams of the 3 flashlights, was fragmentary. Corbin thought he saw, at the extreme edge of his beam's reach, what appeared to be a stone staircase descending along the wall to their left, cut in a wide spiral that followed the curve of the space downward. Buford thought he saw, at the same distance, something on the far side of the void that resembled a row of columns supporting an upper level. Marion Priddy did not report what she saw. She stood at the edge of the platform, holding her camera at her side, and she did not raise the camera to her eye. She said, and Corbyn remembered this word for word from the deposition, she said the void was inhabited. She did not elaborate. Corbyn asked her what she meant. She did not answer him. Instead, she pointed with her flashlight beam at a spot on the platform beside them, about 6 feet away, where the three of them had not been looking. Lined up along the edge of the platform, arranged with what appeared to be deliberate care, were bones. There were 9 skulls. There were assorted long bones. There were rib fragments. And there were smaller bones, the bones of hands and feet, arranged in patterns that suggested they had been laid out by someone with time and attention to give the arrangement. The bones were not old. That is what Corbyn Wells said in his deposition, and it is what Marion Priddy said in her cassette recording, and it is what Sheriff Buford Prather said in the field report he filed with the state police on the 18th of June, 1992. The bones did not have the appearance of ancient remains. They were the colour of bones from a body that had been dead for perhaps 20 or 30 years. The bones were dry, but they were not fossilized. They were not stained. They had not calcified onto the platform. They had been placed there, deliberately, by someone who had come down into the void more recently than any historical account of the property would allow. Marion Priddy walked over to the bones. She knelt beside them. She examined the skulls without touching them. Then she looked up at Corbyn and Buford, and she told them the skulls were not fully human. She said the cranial capacity was too large. She said the orbital sockets were oriented incorrectly. She said the jaw structure suggested a dentition pattern she had never seen in any specimen she had studied in graduate school or since. She said the 9 skulls were the skulls of a species she could not identify. And she said that the arrangement of the smaller bones around the skulls was a burial pattern that resembled, in its general form, arrangements she had seen in photographs of prehistoric ossuaries from the Anatolian plateau, dating from the 6th millennium before the Common Era. Beside the bones, at the head of the arrangement, it was an object that none of the three of them noticed at first, because the shape of it was so ordinary that in the low flashlight beam it registered as nothing more than a raised area of the platform. It was a small stone bowl. It was carved from the same black stone as the coffin in the second chamber. It was empty, but the inside of the bowl was stained, a colour that was not quite black and not quite red, and the stain had the texture of something that had been dried onto the stone in successive thin layers over a very long period of time. Marion Priddy examined the bowl, but did not touch it. She said, quietly, that the arrangement was not a burial. She said the arrangement was an offering. She said the offering had been renewed periodically, based on the number of layers of residue in the bowl, at intervals that she could not calculate without laboratory analysis, but that appeared to her to have been ongoing for a very long time. She said the last renewal of the offering, based on the freshness of the topmost layer, had occurred within the last several years. She did not speculate as to who had made the most recent offering, or how they had gotten down into the chamber past the great slab that had, according to every witness present, been undisturbed for well over a century. Corbyn Wells then noticed something else. On the platform, near the arrangement of bones and the small stone bowl, were faint marks in the fine layer of dust that had accumulated on the polished stone surface. The marks were footprints. They were not their footprints. The three of them had approached the arrangement from the direction of the passage entrance. The footprints in the dust approached the arrangement from a different direction, from the far edge of the platform, where the platform ended and the void began. The footprints came from the void. They did not lead back into it. They ended at the arrangement, and beside the arrangement, at the point where whoever had made them had knelt down. There were no return footprints. Corbyn traced the impressions with the beam of his flashlight. The footprints were not human. The general outline was somewhat similar to a human foot, but the proportions were wrong, and the number of toes, as best Corbyn could count them in the dust, was not 5. He looked at Marion. Marion looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. Buford Prather backed away from the bones. He backed all the way to the wall of the passage they had come down. He kept his flashlight beam trained on the arrangement. He said, and this is on the record in his own filed report, he said that he thought he saw one of the smaller bones move. Corbin looked. Marion looked. None of them saw the bone move again, but Buford would not approach the arrangement a second time. He told Marion he was going back up. He told her that they had to seal the doors behind them. He told her that whoever had left those bones was not necessarily gone. He told her that whoever had left the footprints was, presumably, still on this side of the void and had not yet gone home. Marion did not argue with him. She stood up. She took 19 photographs of the bone arrangement using the last of the film in her camera. Then the three of them turned and began the long climb back up. They resealed the door of the second chamber by pressing the 4 cup depressions in the reverse order. They resealed the door of the first chamber by lowering the great slab back over the shaft. It took them, using the block and tackle and every available man from the excavation crew, 6 additional hours to lower the slab back into position. Delbert Hensley personally supervised the resealing. When it was done, he sat on the ground beside the reinstalled slab and stared at it for a long time. He asked Marion Priddy whether she thought the seal would hold. Marion said she did not know. She said she suspected the seal was not intended to keep anything in. She said she suspected the seal had been intended, when it was first put in place, to keep people from coming down. And she said she was not sure whether the failure of that intention, in the spring of 1992, when Roy Boone's wrecking ball had shaken the ground, had already caused whatever damage was going to be caused. Delbert Hensley took her back to her hotel in Marlinton. He asked her what she was going to do with the photographs. She said she was going to develop them herself, in a dark room at the university, and she was going to make 3 copies of every image. She said she was going to send 1 copy to a colleague she trusted at the Smithsonian. She said she was going to keep 1 copy in a safe deposit box. She said she was going to send the 3rd copy to a journalist she had met once at a conference, a woman named Estelle Beaumont, who had written extensively about anomalous archaeological findings for a small, independent publication based in Boulder, Colorado. Marion did all 3 things over the following 2 weeks. Of the 3 copies, only 1 is known to still exist. The copy sent to the Smithsonian colleague was returned in an envelope with a form letter stating that the colleague was no longer employed by the institution. The copy in the safe deposit box was removed by a party unknown, using a properly executed court order that was later found to have been issued under a case number that did not correspond to any active proceeding in any court in Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, or Virginia. The copy sent to Estelle Beaumont in Boulder is the copy that survives. Estelle Beaumont published none of the images. She kept them in a fireproof cabinet in her home for the next 27 years. She died in 2019. The disposition of her papers is currently the subject of ongoing litigation. Delbert Hensley, in the 8 months he spent in the county archive after the events at Mount Sierra, did not restrict his research to the property in question. He extended his investigation to every parcel of land in Pocahontas County and eventually to every parcel of land in the 7 surrounding counties that had been the subject of a similar sequence of ownership. He was looking for the pattern. The pattern was this. First, a colonial land grant to a nominal recipient who never occupied the property. Second, an early transfer to a company or association with an obscure charter and no apparent commercial purpose. Third, a period of quiet stewardship by that company or association, during which the property was undeveloped and taxes were paid without any visible activity. Fourth, a transfer to a private religious congregation, often one that dissolved shortly after taking possession, and often one whose name involved terms like watch, vigil, assembly, or guardians. Fifth, a transfer to a private family, accompanied by written instructions to construct a house of worship on a specified spot and never to disturb the ground below it. Sixth, the construction of that house of worship, followed by generations of unremarkable use, until the building eventually fell into disrepair or was destroyed. Delbert Hensley identified 17 properties in the 7-county region that matched this exact pattern in every particular. He identified another 42 properties that matched the pattern in most, but not all, particulars. And he identified an additional 111 properties for which the records were incomplete, but for which the pattern could not be ruled out. The 17 properties that matched fully were all the sites of small country churches. 14 of the 17 churches were still standing as of the summer of 1992. Delbert visited all 14. He walked the grounds. He spoke to the congregations. At 3 of the 14 he was able, discreetly, to test the ground behind the pulpit with an 18-inch metal probe. At all 3 sites the probe went in without resistance to its full length. Delbert filed a report of his findings with the West Virginia State Historic Preservation Office in late 1992. The report was 143 pages long. It included the 17 matched properties, the 42 partial matches, and the pattern of ownership sequences he had reconstructed. He requested that the state office coordinate with the appropriate federal agencies to conduct a survey of the sites. He requested that the survey be conducted with proper archaeological protocols. He requested that the findings be made public. In February of 1993, Delbert Hensley was informed by letter that his report had been received, filed, and reviewed. He was thanked for his diligence. He was informed that the state office had determined that the findings did not warrant further investigation and that no additional resources would be allocated to follow up on the matter. He was informed that the report would be retained in the state office's archive under a restricted access designation for a period of 50 years and would not be available for public review until the year 2043. Delbert Hensley never received a copy of his own report back. When he requested one, 3 years later, he was told that the report was not available. In April of 1993, all 17 of the fully matched churches on Delbert's list were visited over a period of 6 weeks by a team of 4 individuals who identified themselves to the local congregations as representatives of a federally funded historic preservation initiative. The team members carried official identification cards. They photographed each building thoroughly. They took soil samples from the properties. They spoke with the pastors and the deacons, and at each of the 17 sites they left behind a small envelope containing a document that was to be filed with the church's own records, instructing the congregation, in language nearly identical to the wax-sealed instruction Delbert had found in the Mount Zerah deed book, never to permit excavation, demolition, or ground disturbance on the property. The envelopes were signed by an individual whose name and title were both illegible. As of the year 2023, all 14 of the 17 churches that were standing in 1992 were still standing. 2 of the 3 that had been demolished were demolished before the federal visit in 1993. Both of those demolition sites had been quietly purchased and sealed under concrete by parties whose ownership records lead to shell companies registered in Delaware. The 3rd demolition was Mount Zerah, which was demolished in April of 1992 before the federal response could be organized. Mount Zerah is the reason the response was organized. 3 of the 14 surviving matched churches deserve individual mention here, because the specifics of their situations extend the pattern in ways that Delbert Hensley documented in appendices to his report, but which the state office declined to include in the version they filed. The first is a small clapboard church in Randolph County, on a hillside overlooking a bend in the Tygart Valley River, where the congregation, during the summer of 1987, had begun to notice that the pews in the front third of the sanctuary were, over a period of several months, sinking imperceptibly into the floor. A structural engineer was called. The engineer found that the foundation directly beneath the pulpit had developed a cavity of unknown extent and origin, and recommended immediate remediation. The congregation instead voted to move the pulpit to the back of the sanctuary and to close off the front third with a low rail. No excavation was performed. The church remains in active use as of the current year. The second is a stone chapel in Nicholas County, built in 1831 on the site of an earlier log meeting house that had burned down under circumstances the county records describe only as regrettable. The stone chapel was constructed by a mason named Alonzo Prickett, who travelled to the site from Philadelphia and who, according to the invoice preserved in the county building records, was paid in gold rather than in the standard currency of the period. Prickett spent 11 months on the site. His invoice records the delivery of quantities of building materials substantially in excess of what would have been required for a chapel of the eventual dimensions. Where the excess materials went is not recorded. The third is a small Presbyterian church in Greenbrier County that was struck by lightning in 1964 and burned entirely to the ground. The congregation, in the year following the fire, began construction of a replacement building on a site approximately 200 yards distant from the ruins of the original. When asked why the replacement was not built on the original foundation, which was still intact, the presiding elder at the time gave an answer that was preserved in the minutes of the building committee. He said that the ground where the old church had stood was, in his view, no longer suitable for a house of worship. He said the burning of the church had, in his view, released something that the church had been keeping contained. He did not elaborate. The minutes record that the committee accepted his recommendation without further discussion. The original foundation is still visible today, in a small, overgrown clearing, unfenced and unmarked, on land that has changed hands 3 times since 1964, and that is currently owned by a limited liability company registered in Delaware. Beyond the 17 sites in Delbert Hensley's report, similar patterns have been reported in scattered accounts from other regions of the eastern United States, from western Pennsylvania to eastern Tennessee, from the Blue Ridge foothills of North Carolina to the coal country of eastern Kentucky. In every case, the pattern involves a small country church, a specific instruction preserved in the property records, and a subterranean feature that is discovered only when the surface structure is damaged, demolished, or investigated in violation of the original instruction. Not all of these accounts are documented to the standard of Delbert Hensley's research. Some are anecdotal. Some are contained in the private papers of local historians who never published their findings. Some are preserved only in the oral traditions of specific families whose ancestors were involved in the original congregations. But the pattern is consistent enough and geographically widespread enough that no honest survey of the record can dismiss it as coincidence. Something was under those churches, something is still under most of them, and the people who arranged, in the colonial and early Republican periods, for the churches to be built where they were built, were doing so with a specific intention that the historical record has been steadily and systematically obscured from acknowledging. The churches were not built to sanctify the ground, the churches were built to seal it. And every Sunday for 200 years, in country churches across the Appalachian Range, hymns were sung above sealed doorways, and prayers were offered above sealed chambers, and communion was taken above sealed remains, and nobody in the pews had any idea what they were sitting on top of. The bell of Mount Zerah, cast in Charleston in 1855, is currently on display at the Pocahontas County Historical Society. It is the only artifact from the church that survived the demolition. The pews were auctioned to private buyers. The pulpit was destroyed in the excavation. The bell was rung, one final time, at the closing service in March of 1992, 4 days before Roy Boone's crew arrived to tear the building down. The federal response to the Mount Zerah discovery began on the 22nd of June, 1992, 7 days after the resealing of the chamber. It began with a phone call to Sheriff Buford Prather from a man who identified himself as an agent of a federal law enforcement agency that Buford, in his official report, declined to name, and which the subsequent redactions of his report have made impossible to identify with certainty. The agent informed Sheriff Prather that a team would be arriving in Pocahontas County within 72 hours. The team, the agent said, would be conducting a preliminary assessment of the Mount Zerah site for the purpose of determining whether the site posed any hazard requiring federal remediation. The agent asked Sheriff Prather to secure the property, to prevent access by any unauthorized persons, and to make himself available to accompany the federal team when they arrived. Sheriff Prather did as he was instructed. The federal team arrived on the 25th of June. It consisted of 11 people. 6 of them were, by their appearance and their equipment, technical personnel of some kind, dressed in unmarked coveralls and carrying instrumentation cases. 3 were what Sheriff Prather described as security personnel, wearing dark suits and carrying sidearms. 2 were what he described as principals, older men who did most of the talking and none of the physical work. The team spent 4 days at the Mount Zerah site. During those 4 days, they reopened the shaft that Delbert Hensley had resealed. They descended into the chamber. They descended through the passage of niches to the second chamber. And they descended, according to Buford Prather's account, through the third passage and out onto the platform overlooking the void. Buford accompanied them only as far as the first chamber. He refused, and this is on his own record, to go any further than that. The Federal team spent, by his estimate, approximately 19 hours in total below ground over the course of the 4 days. When they emerged for the final time, on the evening of the 28th of June, they informed Sheriff Prather that the site had been assessed and that a decision had been reached. The decision was to seal the site permanently. Over the following 6 weeks, a private contractor working under a subcontract to the federal agency in question performed the sealing. The shaft was filled from top to bottom with a reinforced concrete plug, poured in successive lifts, extending from the surface down to a depth of approximately 50 feet. The remaining depth of the shaft, below the concrete plug, was left as it was. The surface above the plug was covered with topsoil and reseeded with pasture grass. The demolition debris from the church was hauled off. The foundation was levelled. By the end of August of 1992, there was no visible evidence at the Mount Zara site that anything had ever stood there. The property was purchased from the surviving members of the congregation at a price substantially above the assessed market value by a limited liability company registered in Delaware whose ownership records lead through 3 additional shell entities before terminating in a foundation whose trustees have not been publicly identified. The property has not been transferred, developed, or accessed by any documented party since. It remains, as of this recording, a fenced parcel of pasture land, posted with no trespassing signs, patrolled quarterly by a private security firm based in Roanoke. Of the individuals who were directly present at the discovery in 1992, the following became of them. Delbert Hensley continued as Pocahontas County Surveyor until his retirement in 1999. He died in 2007 of natural causes. He never spoke publicly about Mount Zara. Roy Boone continued to operate his excavation and salvage business until his death in 2001. His crew, following the initial demolition, was reassigned to other jobs, and none of them ever returned to Mount Zara. Ellis Craft, the 19-year-old who first noticed the warm ground behind the church, left Pocahontas County in the fall of 1992, moved to Ohio, and worked the remainder of his life in a factory in Youngstown. He gave one interview about the Mount Zara events to a small podcast in 2017 in which he described only the warm ground and refused to discuss anything that had happened after Delbert Hensley arrived. Corbin Wells, the mining engineer who descended the shaft, suffered a severe nervous breakdown in the fall of 1992. He was admitted to Western State Hospital in October of that year. He remained institutionalized for the rest of his life. He died in Weston in 2014. He never returned to work in the mining industry. Marion Priddy left the field of geology in the spring of 1994. She took a position as a librarian in the town of Enterprise, Oregon. She lived there until her death in 2016. Her personal papers, deposited with a small historical society in Oregon after her death, contained no reference to the Mount Zara excavation. Her copies of the photographs and her cassette recording were not among her effects. Sheriff Buford Prather completed his term as Pocahontas County Sheriff in 1996 and did not seek re-election. He moved to Florida. He died in 2009. His son, in a 2021 interview conducted for a regional history project, said that his father had never in his life allowed a church to be built on family property and that his father had left specific written instructions in his will forbidding any of his descendants from ever purchasing property that had once been the site of a country church. The son said his father had never explained the instruction. He said his father had told him only that some things were placed in the ground for a reason and that when we sing above them, we should sing loud. If you have been watching this from a small town, and if you can picture, right now, the country church at the edge of your community, the one that has been standing there for as long as anyone can remember, on a rise of pasture, at the end of an unnamed road that everyone uses anyway, then you already know what this is about. You have driven past it 100 times. You have never wondered why it was built there. You have never wondered who chose the spot. You have never wondered what was in the ground before the foundation was poured. And that is exactly how it was supposed to be. That is the point of the singing. The people who arranged the placement of these churches, in the colonial and early Republican periods of this country, understood something that we have collectively forgotten. They understood that there was another history of this continent. They understood that this history had left evidence in the ground, in specific locations, and that the evidence needed to be covered over, watched over, and forgotten. They chose the church because a country church, sung in for generations, becomes invisible. Nobody looks at a country church and wonders what is under it. That is by design. What was under Mount Zera is now under 50 feet of reinforced concrete, and the property is patrolled quarterly, and the records have been sealed until 2043, and the people who saw what was down there are dead or were driven mad or moved away and refuse to speak about it. But the other 17 sites in Delbert Hensley's report are still standing, and the 42 partial matches are still standing, and the 111 possible matches are still standing, and nobody has looked under any of them because the seals are still holding. The singing is still going on, and whatever is under those buildings is still, presumably, waiting. If this is the first time you're hearing any of this, subscribe to this channel now, because next week we are going to Kentucky, to a small town in the eastern part of the state where a barn burned down in 1987, and the family that owned the property found something under the barn floor that they never reported to anyone, and that is still on their property, and that they have agreed, 37 years after the fact, to finally show on camera. Subscribe now. That video will drop next Tuesday. Do not miss it. And in the comments, if you have not already, tell us the county and the state you are watching from, because the map is not going to fill itself in. The people watching this video right now, in every state where there is a country church at the end of a nameless road, are the map, fill it in.